Happy to be talking to Professor Matthew Frye Jacobson about his recent book, One Grain of Sand, that was published by Bloomsbury Academic Press in 2019. So as an interpreter of the songs that you write about, many of which were already in the folk repertoire, you describe how Odetta also queered the gendered conventions of music as it was inherited by her. Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which she queered those conventions?
Yeah, I think it's an important part of her work. I mean, some of the things that she did, well, by choosing the repertoire itself, I mean, most of the songs that she performed came out of a very male kind of tradition. And some of the things that she did with her voice played with a kind of gender neutrality or ambiguity that I think was really important to the power of the song. And it was something that a lot of critics at the time commented on without knowing exactly how to understand it. A lot of white listeners didn't like it, frankly. They wanted her to sound more like a lady or appear more like a lady. But I think that her conscious decision not to be that performer was part of how she saw the politics of what she was doing. I mean, it was about kind of disrupting the status quo, disrupting expectation, pushing people to think in new ways. And I think that for her, gender was as important a part of that project as race was.
Now, I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit more about Odetta as a performer. You've written, of course, extensively about this album as a piece, as an archive in and of itself. But you also write in the book about Odetta on stage, what she did for audiences, how audiences understood her in the various settings in which she performed before and after 1963. So I wonder if you could take us through some sense of what audiences would have seen, what they would have appreciated, what they would have heard, had they been in one of Odetta's performances around the time in which One Grain of Sand appeared.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it's important to remember how young she was. She was still just in her late 20s. And so she was still developing as an artist or maybe early 30s by then. But she was still developing as an artist, and she was changing. And now with the advantage of retrospect, you can really see that. One of the most striking things about her, and this was part of her power, and it was something that she never stopped using, was that classical training. I mean, she held the stage with the kind of majesty of the great operatic singers. She just did. She held the stage in a way that she just looked immovable. She looked as immovable as she sounded. And it was part of the power of her performance. In those years, she had a kind of seriousness that I think was more characteristic of her performances in those years than later on. Her friends would say, was one of the funniest people you would ever meet in your life. And there's plenty of evidence for that. And you can hear that in some of the later live recordings, but for the most part in the later ones. You don't hear that so much in the late 50s or early 60s. I think that became more a part of her kind of stage patter later on. But she had a fearsome sense of humor, and she, over time, learned how to deploy that. But I think that was less a part of her act in the years that we're talking about. I think the more striking thing through probably the late 60s was just the power of her presence and her seriousness of purpose.
So Matt, you've written about Odetta, you've spoken to many people about Odetta, you've taught about Odetta. I know she's made her way into the courses that you've given over the years. And my sense is, from hearing you talk, that you think of her as a person who was profoundly influential in the late 20th century, but also perhaps a person who's not widely recognized by many people today. So can you talk a little bit more about how you see the influence of Odetta on, say, other musicians? You mentioned this in the book, people like Joan Baez, Rhiannon Giddens, her influence on politically engaged Americans, people like Rosa Parks, artists like Spike Lee, perhaps the ways we understand African American history today. Love to hear you talk a little bit more about her perhaps unrecognized influence.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's one of the puzzles really that I never quite resolved is why is it that our students really don't know her? I mean, she's almost unknown among younger Americans right now, although I think that that may be changing. My book, it turns out, is the first of a flurry that are going to be coming out soon about her. So maybe that will change. But it is really fascinating that after about the 70s or maybe the 80s, when she was on the college circuit, like she would travel around, she would play at college campuses. I think she was still well known among college students. Certainly when I was in college in the 70s, and probably beyond that. But then really kind of drops out as someone who is kind of famous to a younger generation. Which is just kind of odd because she was truly one of the most famous performers of her generation at the time. I mean, at the time that she's, standing next to Martin Luther King in 1963, like, everybody knew who she was and everybody knew why she was there. So it's kind of startling that ceased to be the case at some point. On the other hand, she never stopped being a musician's musician, and I think she still is very much that. So you mention her name to someone like Brianna Giddens, and there's an immediate enthusiasm and excitement to talk about who she was and her influence and what she did, and I've been privileged to have this conversation with several current singers like Giddens or Valerie June. And for them, Odetta never went away. I mean, she never stopped being important. And it's one of the important and puzzling perhaps things about the arc of her career and her fame. That Bob Dylan famously said that he picked up a flat top Gibson guitar because of Odetta. Like that was the power of her influence at the time. And somehow that just faded for listeners. And I guess, folk as a genre is not nearly as popular now as it was, a generation ago, but still, people, our students know who Woody Guthrie was, right? But I rare is the student who knows who Odetta was until I tell them.
Well, I would just say the book, One Grain of Sand, goes a long way towards explaining Odetta, I think, for audiences today and contextualizing her and using her to help rethink the ways in which African American history from roughly 1863 to roughly 1963, with some bleeding on both sides, was formulated by her and can be reinterpreted with her in mind by historians, artists, and others today. And I guess I just want to ask you, by way of closing, if you have any other thoughts about the ways in which you hope that the book that you've written will work in the world. What are some of the things that you would love readers, whether they're students or fellow academics or others, to appreciate about Odetta, or to be thinking as they walk away from this book about other projects that they might take up or other ways of understanding the world?
I really appreciate the question. Even if I've learned over the years to try to be very modest in my ambitions for a book, because when you send it out into the world, you just never know what people are going to do with it or how it will be taken up. I guess my fondest hopes would be twofold. One would be that it would urge people to pick up her records again and listen to them and really think about the brilliance of her artistry and the power of the political work that she did through her singing. I mean, if in some small way the book contributed to a renewed interest in Odetta herself, that would be probably the most a person could hope for, writing a book. The other thing I would say, though, is that there is something about method that's embedded in the book that I hope our students would pick up as well. That intersection that I mentioned before, that zone where social and political history meet culture and the culture industries and cultural production and artistry and genre is a really, really rich zone. And I would hope that the book might model something about cultural analysis and the ways in which something as seemingly self-evident as a song can actually open up all kinds of doors for historical inquiry. So that's maybe the wider ambition of the book. But if the book achieves anything at all, I'll be happy.
I think it achieves a lot. Matthew Frye Jacobson, thank you for talking to us about your most recent book, One Grain of Sand.
Thank you so much for the invitation. This has really been a delight.